AI responsibility gaps and asymmetries between praise and blame is my topic, and I'm going to try to explain some of those different terms there that I have up on the screen. But let me start, however, first with a few examples to get us kind of up and running. And so let's see. I want to start with this example. So pretty much, I think Ruby, you have your mic on. Just to let you know. Okay, back to the example. So whenever people talk about progress in the field of AI, they pretty much always bring up this case where the computer program AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, pictured here, who was the world champion of Go at the time in the game of Go in the year 2016. So actually, Lee Sedol, he did win one game against AlphaGo. They played a total of 5 games, and so he won one of them. Well done by him. However, he lost the other 4. And so when people talk about this example, they often either talk about Lee Sedol, the world champion of Go, who lost against this computer program, or they talk about the AlphaGo, the computer program. But I want to talk about someone else, namely the man on the left side. So this was an employee of DeepMind. So that's the company behind AlphaGo, the computer program. And his job was to move around the playing stones on the board. And as you can see there on the left of the screen, AlphaGo shows like where the stone is supposed to go on the board. And then his job is to kind of move around the stones. Now, no one talks about him because no one thinks that he won the game of Go or the 4 games of Go against Lee Sedol. No one thinks that he's the new world champion. He doesn't deserve any credit. But let's say that instead of having a computer screen showing where the moves are supposed to be, that he had, okay, I think someone has their mic on, just so you know, you can check if you have your mics on. Anyway, there was some sound in the background, doesn't matter. Now, okay, let's imagine that instead of having this computer screen showing everyone that there's a computer program telling him what to do, that he had tiny earbuds in his ear, and that no one knew that he was getting advice about where to put stones from a computer program. Then suddenly people might say like, wow, this guy is great at Go, he can beat the world champion. Of course, as soon as they would find out that actually an AI program was telling him what to do, they would say that, okay, well, it turns out that he wasn't so good at Go at all, and he doesn't deserve to get the new, the first prize and be considered the world champion. So he's not, it seems, responsible for this victory. And so one thing that I think is interesting to think about is whether, as we move into the future, a lot of us are going to be like this man on the left. We are going to do what AI programs tell us to do, but we're not going to deserve any credit. We're not going to be seen as responsible for the, whatever good results we might bring about, or whatever achievements we may go through the motions of carrying out, so to speak. So that's one kind of case where there seems to be a gap in human responsibility for a certain outcome. Like the winning of the game, we shouldn't say that the person on the left is responsible for this. You might say it's the computer program. You might say it's the company who developed the computer program. But even the company behind the computer program, I mean, they created this deep learning system, but then AlphaGo learned how to play Go by studying thousands of human-played Go games, and then AlphaGo also played millions of games against itself, and that's how this computer program developed the strategies. And so the people work for DeepMind that had not played those thousands of Go games that were in the training data, and they also didn't play those millions of games that AlphaGo played against itself. And so you could also argue that DeepMind were not the winners of this Go game. It was the computer program, but you might think that a computer program is not really a responsible agent, and so perhaps there was no one here who was really the true sort of responsible winner of this game, but there was a loser, namely Lee Sedol, and there was a person who sort of went through the motions of winning the game, the man on the left. Now, so this is one example that people always talk about when they talk about progress in AI, and I think that we don't talk enough about the person on the left, which is an interesting person to focus on. Let's go to another example that's exactly 2 years later. And people often talk about this when they talk about, again, words about responsibility. And this is when, so this was in 2018 in March, and actually the Go game was in 2016 in March, just exactly 2 years later. And this is when a woman named Elaine Hertzberg was hit and killed by a self-driving car in not California, but in Arizona. And actually, there was a human involved here too. In addition to the victim, there was the person on the left here in the picture who was the so-called safety driver. So this person's job was to sit in the self-driving car and take over in case anything bad would happen. But you can actually watch a video of this incident, and I would not recommend it because it's actually quite distressing. You see the person on the left there, I think she's sort of looking down at her phone for a few seconds. She looks up, she sees that this person is on the road, too late to react. She can just sit and watch as the self-driving car drives straight into this person who then subsequently dies on the way to the hospital. Now, that's a case where a lot of people first said, well, it's the human in the car, that's her fault, it's her responsibility. But after the investigation that was carried out, it was decided that, well, maybe it wasn't her fault. Was it the company trying out the self-driving car, Uber? Well, they said Arizona, the state of Arizona, allowed us to perform these tests on the road, so they should be blamed. And the state of Arizona said, well, it's not our fault, we were not driving the car. So it's a question like who exactly is responsible when AI brings about this, in this case, an unfortunate outcome. Now, those are standard cases that people have talked about for years. I mean, this was in 2018. And here's another one, the military robots that would operate autonomously. There's even a campaign, as you can see here, to stop what they call killer robots. And one of the arguments that this campaign against military robots tends to offer is that they think that there would be worries about human responsibility. Who exactly would be responsible if and when military robots operating autonomously would kill the wrong people? So there too, that's something that's been discussed quite a bit when it comes to responsibility in AI. Now, fast forward to more recent times, and I mean, generative AI didn't come about with ChatGPT. That it existed before, of course, and ChatGPT is one version of this type of technology. But with ChatGPT in November of 2022, the whole world, so to speak, started talking about technologies where you can put in an instruction, and then the technology would write a text, would produce an image, or would produce a piece of music, or whatever it might be. And one of the questions that arises is that who exactly, let's say that I create a piece of music, that I write a text, perhaps I'm a student in a class, and instead of writing my own essay, when I'm supposed to write an essay, I ask ChatGPT to write an essay, and then I put my name on it and I hand it in. Do I deserve a good grade if the text is good? A lot of teachers I know would say, no, you have to write your own essay if you want a good grade. Now, here's a similar case. I don't know if people have seen this picture before. This actually won the first prize in something which I believe is called the Sony photography competition or something like that. However, the artist behind this photo, Boris Ellickson, revealed that this was not a photograph. This was created with generative AI. And he said that, I don't deserve a photography prize because I didn't take a photograph. This is not a photograph. I am not a photographer. I am a chromatographer, he said. I create my art with generative AI. So I'm handing back my first prize because you shouldn't tell me that I'm a good photographer if I create images with, generative AI. And I mean, clearly he managed to create a compelling image because the jury thought that this was the best photograph. But as he himself was arguing, it wasn't a photograph, so I shouldn't get praised for being a good photographer. Again, I might be, he said, a good chromatographer, but that's a different kind of skill. So according to him, we should change how we think about art. We should always ask, is this a product of a human act of art creation, or is this a result of the operation of generative AI? Now, so he said that he shouldn't get credit for being a good photographer. Now, let's think about a case of someone being blamed for using generative AI in a certain way. And so this was a news story from The Guardian, the newspaper, and it turned out, so this was, during the mushroom collection season in the UK, and then some people had been selling books on Amazon that were obviously written with the help of ChatGPT or some other type of large language model. Now, the problem was that these were mushroom collection books, and eating the wrong mushroom can be very dangerous because mushrooms can be poisonous. And ChatGPT doesn't know strictly speaking, which mushroom is safe to eat and which one isn't. And indeed, some of those books had been recommending eating poisonous mushrooms. And the people that had put the names on those books and was trying to make money off of those books on Amazon, they were very much blamed, and Amazon took away their books from, they didn't sell them anymore. And so this was a case where people were blamed for some dangerous recommendations made by generative AI. So on the one hand, people like Boris Ellickson said that you shouldn't call me a good photographer if I create my photographs within quotes using generative AI. However, if you write books and they contain dangerous information or advice using ChatGPT or some other form of generative AI, then you might be blamed for the output that you produce. And so it's interesting to think about under what circumstances would you deserve praise, if any praise, and if under what circumstances would you deserve any kind of blame for the outputs that you might create using generative AI. So these all are examples that are meant to illustrate that there can be different types of questions about possible gaps in responsibility when we use AI. And one of the things I want to do today is to sort of identify 4 different kinds of possible gaps in responsibility that relate to both praise and blame for outcomes that we might produce with AI. And then I want to talk about what I think are some interesting differences or asymmetries between praise and blame, and relate those back to the 4 gaps in responsibility. And these asymmetries have to do both with the motivations that people have or incentives that they have to, on the one hand, try to get credit for something good that happens, but on the other hand, perhaps to try to avoid being blamed for bad things that happen. And I think that the motivations that we have with respect to these different kinds of ways of taking responsibility, seeking praise or trying accepting blames, are quite different. But on the other hand, there's also the question about under what circumstances do you actually deserve to be praised, to get credit for something, to get recognition for something, and under what circumstances do you deserve to be blamed. And the incentives and motivations that we might have with respect to praise and blame may point, I think, in a different direction than the conditions under which we actually do deserve praise and blame for something. I will explain what I mean by that as we go along. All right, so my title was AI, Responsibility Gaps and Asymmetries Between Praise and Blame. So now I'm going to just say something about each keyword in the title of my presentation. So AI, of course, people are familiar with. But I just wanted to mention that there has been a lot of discussion ever since the discussion of AI started about 70 years ago in the mid-50s. I mean, and even before then, when Alan Turing and others wrote papers before the term AI had been introduced, already Alan Turing and others, they discussed, okay, what exactly would it mean for a machine to think or to be intelligent? How should we think about that? And then in 1955 became the term AI, the term was invented. And so since then, every now and then, people have sort of suggested different definitions. What exactly is AI? Should we define this with reference to the techniques that are used, rule-based systems, machine learning, hybrid systems, and so on? Or should we think about this in a more functional way, namely asking what kind of functions can technologies have? And I'm going to here use the latter kind of definition. So I'm going to say that a technology is an AI technology, it's artificially intelligent, if the technology can take over or perform tasks such that when you perform that task, then you have to use your intelligence. So let's go to the examples in the beginning. If you are writing a text, let's say a book about mushrooms, then you have to use your intelligence. If you can write a book about mushrooms using a computer program, then that computer program is artificially intelligent. If you have to use your intelligence to play the game Go, and you do, then if you have a computer program that can play Go, then it's an artificially intelligent Go playing program. Or when you drive a car, you have to use your practical intelligence. If you can hand over the driving to a computer inside of the car, then you have an artificially intelligent car. So technologies that can take over tasks that we use our intelligence to perform, those are artificially intelligent. Now, if you think about AI according to that sort of definition, then you can quite quickly see how worries about possible gaps in responsibility might arise. Because if you say that the essence of AI is to give over tasks to technologies where those tasks are ones that we use our intelligence to perform, well, most of the things that we do with our intelligence involve responsibilities. So if you write a book, if you drive a car, if you maybe are a doctor making medical recommendations, then those are all things that you do with the help of your intelligence, but they're also all things that involve responsibilities. Or there can also be positive things. Again, I mean, maybe I'm writing books, and maybe I'm writing I don't know, poetry or whatever it might be. I'm using my intelligence, and I might be someone who gets credit, or should be, get some kind of recognition for these nice, perhaps, uses of my intelligence. And so you hand over these tasks to a computer program. Large language model writes your text or poem instead of you. The self-driving car drives the car itself, or whatever it might be. Then you, a responsible person, are not doing these things anymore. A technology or a computer program are doing them instead. Unless it's a responsible agent, and unless we can tell a story about why you're still responsible, even though you're not doing the thing anymore and a computer is doing it instead, then we might have some sort of gap, or at least confusion with respect to who exactly is responsible. Okay, now when it comes to responsibility, as I've already mentioned, I mean, like, on the one hand, if you do something good and we say that, wow, you really did well here, I mean, you deserve praise, you're going to get credit for this, you're going to get recognition, that's a way of holding you responsible in a sort of nice way, because you're responsible for this good text, for this nice piece of art, or whatever it might be. So this is one kind of responsibility, that the one that's related to praise and recognition, etc. On the other hand, if you do something bad, if you're not being very careful when you're driving, and so accidentally you cause damage just to personal property or maybe a person, then you will be held responsible in the way of being blamed, or perhaps even punished for what you did. So responsibility is not only about blaming, it's also about who to praise and who gets credit for what. And so when it comes to praise and blame, I should say, I'm talking about praise and blame for good results or good outcomes that we might bring about. So you might look at a piece of art, you might look at a text, you might look at a recommendation, or whatever it might be, and then ask, okay, this was a good or bad outcome, something that happened. Who, if anyone, is responsible? Who deserves praise or blame? Now, that's what I'm thinking about. So, okay, now, as I do that, I'm interested in the question, are the differences between praise and blame, like, are they completely symmetrical in how they work, or is it perhaps the case that we are more eager to get praise for good outcomes than we are to be blamed for bad outcomes? I think that's the case. Well, what about if something bad happens and it's possible to blame other people? Well, then perhaps we might be pretty quick and pretty happy to say, yes, those other people are to blame. But if something good happens, then maybe we ourselves may put ourselves forward and say, well, I had something to do with it, I deserve part of the credit. So there might be, on the one hand, an asymmetry between praise and blame, in the sense that it's nicer to be praised than to be blamed. And there might also be an asymmetry in the sense that getting praise ourselves is nice. We prefer it when other people are blamed when bad things happen. Now, that has to do with the motivations and incentives that we have to accept praise and blame. But there's a different question of under what circumstances we actually deserve praise or blame. And so it may very well be that I try to take credit for a text that I had written using, let's say, ChatGPT or some other Bard or some other large language model. But other people might say, well, you didn't put enough effort yourself into this, you didn't show enough skill or whatever because you used this technology, you don't deserve praise. Or I use a technology and I allow something bad to happen, and I say, well, it wasn't my fault, it was the technology. People may still think that you deserve blame. So it's interesting to think both about, am I willing to accept blame, or am I seeking praise on the one hand, and do I really deserve praise or blame on the other? Okay, now let's talk about under what circumstances we deserve praise and blame for things. And I think that when it comes to praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, there are, in sort of commonsensical ways of thinking and the circumstances under which we praise and blame people, there are lots of interesting differences, asymmetries. So one, for example, so let's say that I am I'm being nice to you, and you think that that's not what a nice person, but then it turns out that you realize that I'm only being nice to you because I think that it promotes my own personal self-interest. Then suddenly you might think that, well, this guy wasn't so nice after all. Yes, they're behaving in a polite and nice way, but it's only in order to get some sort of end self-interested goal that they're trying to reach. So praiseworthiness seems to require that you're not just doing something as a means to your own self-interest. You have to do it for some other reason. Maybe because you think it's right and good to be nice to other people, then maybe you're praiseworthy for it. However, when it comes to blame, let's say that instead of being nice to you, I'm being quite rude and unfriendly. And then it turns out that I'm doing that because I think that's a good way of promoting my own self-interest. I just want something and I want it quickly and I don't care what you think. Now we don't really care about the fact that this is a means to an end. It's enough that you're being rude and unfriendly in order for me to be blameworthy for my behavior. So it seems that when it comes to being praiseworthy for something, whether you're doing it as a means or an end makes a big difference. When it comes to whether you're blameworthy for some piece of behavior, whether you're doing it as a means or an end doesn't seem to matter in the same way. You're more blameworthy if you're harming someone, let's say, as an end in itself. That seems to be a form of hate crime. But even if you're harming someone, not because you think that that's a goal that you are trying to achieve, but it's a means to your end, you might still be blameworthy. So that's one relevant difference between praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. Another one is that sometimes if I just allow something bad to happen, I don't step in and prevent something from happening if I could without too much risk to myself, that might be enough to make myself blameworthy. So let's see, maybe a silly example. If I see two children, they're fighting and there's a bigger child sort of hitting the smaller one, without any risk to myself, I could step in and stop this bigger child from harming the smaller child, and I fail to do so. I allow this to happen. I might be blameworthy to some extent, even if maybe the big child should get a lot of the blame, but still, I mean, you can be at fault to some extent for allowing something bad to happen. However, when it comes to good things, just allowing something good to happen doesn't seem to be enough for you to be praiseworthy. So let's say I observe someone perform a good deed and I don't stop it. I just allow them to perform the good deed. Well, I mean, I don't really deserve any praise for this. The person who performed the good action, the good deed, they are the ones who deserve to get praise. But again, allowing something bad to happen can sometimes be enough for me to deserve a certain amount of blame. I might not be the one that deserves the most blame, but I deserve part of the blame, perhaps. I should have stepped in and done something. And I already mentioned this in passing before, but so there's a paper by Hannah Maslin and her colleagues who discuss, under what circumstances do people deserve praise for good things that happen? And they say, well, actually, when it comes to deserving praise, you really should make some sort of effort. You should show some sort of talent. You should make sacrifices. It has to be that you're very actively involved in producing the good outcome. Then you may possibly deserve praise for what you did. If you have to show no effort, it's not hard work for you, and you don't have to really have any particular talent or skill, or you have to make no sacrifice, then in a certain sense, you're pretty much allowing the good thing to happen. You're not really doing it, they say. However, so when it comes to blame, on the other hand, and if I'm doing something that I deserve blame for, it doesn't necessarily have to be that I'm particularly skilled at harming other people, or that I'm putting in extra efforts, or that I'm making some sort of sacrifice. Actually, the very fact that I'm being lazy, that I'm not using my moral understanding of what I should do in the situation, and that I'm not making any sacrifices to my own self-interest or whatever it might be, again, that might actually be part of why I'm blameworthy. So it seems to be, again, that on the one hand, you have to make efforts, show talents and skills, and make sacrifice in order to be praiseworthy. That doesn't seem to apply to being blameworthy. Okay, so one last thing about differences between conditions for being praised and blameworthy. And I should say, by the way, that I think that there are more differences, but these are just 4 examples. Now, if I hand over a task to some other person, so if I ask Frank, for example, to write my next philosophy paper, let's say he does a good job, I put my name on the paper. I don't really deserve credit for the good paper that he wrote. Maybe we should erase my name and put Frank's name on the paper instead. If, however, so I don't deserve praise for it. If let's say that I really dislike a person and I want to write sort of an angry note describing all their faults, and then I ask Frank to do it, and let's say he's very diabolical, so he writes this very insulting letter about a person, and then I put my name on it. Well, again, Frank might deserve some of the blame here, but I may share in that blame because I put him up to doing this thing. It was my idea, and I let him do the dirty work, so to speak. But I might be blameworthy to some extent because this was something that I outsourced this piece of dirty work to someone else and tried to avoid maybe responsibility, but I can't get off the hook in that way. I might still deserve to be blamed to some extent. So there seems to be all these interesting differences, I think, between the conditions under which you deserve praise on the one hand and the conditions under which you deserve blame on the other. And I think that that's really interesting when we think about what happens when AI do things for us. Can we still deserve praise and blame? And there might be a difference between the two. Okay, so let's go back to gaps in responsibility. And I promised that I would distinguish among 4 different kinds of gaps. So here we go. And I'm going to do that with the help of 2 distinctions. The first distinction is between what I call negative responsibility and positive responsibility. Now I know that Bernard Williams uses the term negative responsibility in a famous book, Utilitarianism For and Against, in a certain way. If you've read that book, I'm not using it in the way that he did. I just mean that if something negative or something bad has happened, and we're asking who is responsible for the bad thing that happened, then that's a question about what I'm here calling negative responsibility. If something positive or good happens, and we're asking who's responsible for this really nice thing that happened, then we are asking about what I'm here calling positive responsibility. Responsibility for good things, positive responsibility, responsibility for negative things. That's what I mean by negative responsibility. Okay, so that's one distinction. Now, another distinction that philosophers sometimes make when they discuss, very often when they discuss technology, but also when they talk about things such as climate change, is responsibility looking into the past on the one hand and responsibility looking into the future. So if there has been an accident or someone has been harmed, or if someone has been saved or whatever it might be, they were in trouble and then someone helped them, you're asking questions about, you're looking backwards and saying, well, who was responsible for that problem, or who was responsible for the good thing that happened? Those are questions about what I'm calling here backward-looking responsibility, looking into the past, asking who was responsible for something that already did happen. But you may also look into the future. You might start worrying that the climate is changing and we have to do something now to try to prevent this. Then you can ask, well, whose responsibility is it to now do something to try to save the world, basically, so that future generations can enjoy it too? That is a question about who is now responsible for trying to steer the future in a certain direction. Or if you're a parent, you may have a forward-looking responsibility to try to raise your children in a good way so that when they become adults, they will be well-adjusted and that things will go well for them in their lives. That's also a responsibility that looks towards future possible outcomes. Now, if you have these 2 distinctions, you can create a nice matrix. And so you could have responsibilities that have to do with negative outcomes in a backward-looking way. So, who is responsible for something bad that already happened? Or you might ask, who is responsible for something positive that already happened in the past? Or you might look into the future and think about possible risks and bad outcomes that could occur and ask, who has a negative forward-looking responsibility to try to prevent that bad outcome? Or you might look into the future and ask, who has a responsibility to try to produce a good outcome? That's a question about positive forward-looking responsibility. Now, if you take this diagram and you just add the word gap to it, like this, you get 4 different possible kinds of gaps in responsibility. So there could be backward-looking, forward-looking, negative and positive responsibilities. So if something bad has happened and we don't know how to find someone to be held responsible for this, and maybe it's unfair to hold people responsible, then there might be a gap in backward-looking negative responsibility. Something good has happened or could happen in the future, but we don't know who's responsible for the good thing that did happen, nor do we know who's responsible for trying to make the future better. Then we might have backward or forward-looking positive responsibility gaps. Or if there's a risk that we see on the horizon, so to speak, looking into the future, but we really can't find anyone who's clearly responsible for trying to prevent this risk from materializing, then we might have what I'm here calling a forward-looking negative responsibility gap. Now, in the academic literature about gaps in responsibility, most people who have talked about gaps in responsibility have talked about what I'm calling backward-looking negative gaps. And so, for example, Robert Sparrow talks about what he calls killer robots, very much like the campaign against killer robots, arguing that gaps in responsibility can occur if we hand over military tasks to AI technologies. Fewer people have talked about what I'm calling positive responsibility gaps. I wrote a paper together with John Danaher about what we call gaps in achievement. Again, I like the guy who plays Go, so to speak, by having AlphaGo tell him what to do. It wasn't an achievement on his part to, so to speak, win those games within quotes. So there's a gap in human achievement there, on his part, perhaps at least. Now, I myself, and also some other authors, such as my colleagues in the Netherlands, Santon de Sio and McCatchy, have written about possible gaps in forward-looking responsibility. Very few people have written about, at least in these terms, about what I'm calling positive forward-looking gaps in responsibility. I think they happen often because when we think about special responsibilities to make good things happen, then we often think in terms of special relationships. I mentioned the case of parents, and I think that we all tend to agree that parents have a kind of positive responsibility to make things go well for their children. But when it comes to perfect strangers, we seldom recognize ourselves as having a sort of strong responsibility to make things go well for them. We might have a responsibility to try to avoid harm to them, but that's a different thing. So here, I mean, people don't discuss this in these terms. It's interesting to ask, for example, what about the value alignment problem? Would that be an example of such a responsibility gap if we cannot find people whose responsibility it is to try to align AI with human values? Anyway, this is just to say that there are lots of kinds of gaps. And another question, of course, is should we mind that these gaps, is it bad if people cannot be held responsible? Actually, people differ who have written about this in terms of their views. And so John Danaher, for example, has argued, at least when it comes to blame, if no one can be blamed, maybe that's not such a bad thing. I mean, it's really unpleasant to be held responsible in the sense of being blamed. Maybe if AI creates gaps or voids in responsibility in that sense, maybe it's not so bad. Simpson and Muller, they say, well, it is bad, but we can tolerate it. Let's say that self-driving cars, on the whole, are going to be good for humanity because maybe they're going to make traffic overall safer. Well, there might still be responsibility gaps when something does happen that's bad, but on the whole, the results are better, so we can tolerate gaps every now and then. My colleague here at LMU Munich, Christian List, he says that no, it's always intolerable when things happen and we can't hold anyone responsible, so we shouldn't create technologies that create gaps in responsibility. So you can see that there's quite a range here in terms of whether people think that this is a bad thing, that there are gaps in responsibility. I think that when we think about this, we should really ask, are we talking about what I'm calling positive responsibility gaps? There's no one that can get credit for something good. Or are we talking about negative responsibility gaps? There's no one that can be blamed. And here too, like if it comes to us ourselves, we really want to get credit for good things that happen. People tend to be motivated to do that, to seek praise for good things. And they tend to want to blame other people when bad things happen. So how bad we think this might depend on whether we're talking about the self or others, and whether we're talking about positive and negative responsibility. Okay, so a lot of people agree with Christian List. They think that we should try to fill responsibility gaps, and it's not tolerable to have them. So one question then is, could we fill them by asking people to kind of volunteer themselves, either people or organizations? I mean, for example, the car companies Audi and Volvo, they have said that when they create self-driving cars, they will take responsibility for anything bad that happens. Maybe that's the way to go. Now, here, though, we get to the problems related to incentives and motivations to take or accept responsibility, because when good things have happened, people tend to be very happy to say, yes, I had something to do with it. I deserve part of the credit or praise. People are quite motivated because it's nice for them, because like if you get credit for something, your popularity might go up, new opportunities might open up for you, people might want to become your friends, and so on and so forth. However, if you become blamed for something, then people might not want to be your friends anymore. Your popularity might go down. opportunities will close that you had before. And so lots of bad things can happen to you if you're blamed. So there's very strong incentive on the one hand to accept credit when something good happens, but there's no corresponding strong incentive to accept blame. And so it might be much harder to fill negative responsibility gaps by just accepting, hoping for people to accept responsibility. Now, what about good things in the past versus good things in the future? Well, after something good has happened, there might be a lot of candidates who say, well, yeah, I had something to do with it. You know, I deserve part of the credit, part of the praise. But if you look into the future and we see possible good things that could happen, then people might say, well, you know, I'm busy with other things. It's an opportunity cost for me to have to take on the responsibility to bring on the good outcome. And so there you might have fewer candidates that have strong incentives to want to become responsible. So really, the only kind of gap that's easy to fill, I think, when it comes to just hoping that people will step forward and take responsibility are really what I'm calling backward-looking positive gaps. But on the other hand, the question arises, do they really deserve credit for these things that people might want to take responsibility for? And so let's go back then to these asymmetries, not with respect to people's motivations to take responsibility, but with respect to their possible blameworthiness or praiseworthiness. And how does that relate to the question of how to fill gaps in responsibility? Is it, for example, easier to fill positive or negative responsibility gaps, or maybe vice versa? I actually think that it's from the point of view of the criteria that we use to assess whether people are blameworthy or praiseworthy, it's actually easier to be blameworthy for things that are created by AI than to be praiseworthy for good outputs from AI. And let me tell you why I think so. Well, let's go back, for example, to this distinction between just allowing something good to happen and allowing something bad to happen. As I said before, when we allow bad things to happen, we don't step in and try to prevent them, then that can make us blameworthy. So if you allow, for example, AI technologies to create bad outcomes, to spread misinformation, if you continually use technologies that you see are biased against certain people, then you might not be wanting to discriminate against certain people, but you're allowing it to happen. And given that allowing bad things to happen can be enough to be blameworthy, you might be blameworthy for this. But if I allow something good to happen, that is often not enough for me to be praiseworthy. So just allowing, let's say, you know, generative AI to produce beautiful images or nice text or whatever, that might not be enough for me to deserve credit for these outcomes. Also, I said before that I'm using this example with like asking Frank to do something on my behalf. Like if I ask him to do something nasty, then maybe I get part of the blame because I sort of put him up to it and I'm partly responsible. I can't get off the hook by just saying that, well, someone else actually carried out the dirty work for me. But if I ask him to do something that requires talent and skill and he goes off and does a great job, then suddenly maybe he should get all the credit. I mean, okay, maybe I had the good idea for him to write the book or whatever it was, but he really deserves most of the credit, the credit, the praise for this. So again, if I hand over a task to AI, you know, write my next paper or, you know, do this or that, then actually if there ends up being a lot of factual mistakes in my paper and I start recommending, for example, eating poisonous mushrooms, as in the case before, then it seems that just outsourcing this task to another agent is not enough for me to get off the hook. However, if that mushroom collection book actually contains some useful information, or if it contains some well-written sentences that were really poetic about the joys of mushroom collection, eating, whatever, then here, I think it's going to be much harder for me to deserve praise for this because I didn't really do anything. In particular, I may not have displayed any particular skills. I may not have made any big efforts because, I mean, again, I was handing over the writing of this to the AI program, and I did the opposite of making a sacrifice. I you know, made it easier for myself, and so I didn't have to do so much work. So there's much need of an effort or sacrifice on my part. So why should I deserve praise for any positive outputs from these AI technologies that are taking over tasks from me? But again, I might be allowing something bad to happen. I might be not trying to prevent a bad outcome. I might be complicit in that sense, and so I could still be blameworthy. So it just seems that by these types of different criteria for praiseworthiness on one hand and blameworthiness on the other, where praiseworthiness criteria tends to really require an active involvement, showing skill, showing effort. That just makes it hard to still deserve credit if a technology is doing it instead of you. You don't have to use your intelligence, the AI technology does it. But again, on the blameworthiness side, I might be allowing bad things to happen. I may fail to step in to prevent them, and I may, still be the person who, so to speak, outsourced the task to this other person who, in a certain sense, did the dirty work on my behalf. So I might still be blameworthy. So I would suggest to you that it's actually easier to be blameworthy for bad outcomes produced by AI than it is to be praiseworthy for good outcomes produced by AI. Okay, so conclusions. One, I think that when we think about responsibility in AI, we shouldn't only ask who's to blame when something bad happens. We should also ask who, if anyone, can get credit when something good happens. And, there might be a difference here. And indeed, when it comes to whether people want a credit for good outcomes produced by AI, and whether they are willing to accept blame for bad outcomes, then people might be much more strongly incentivized to try to take credit for the good and to try to avoid blame for the bad. And yet, at the same time, when it comes to the criteria that we typically use for whether people deserve praise or blame, it might be the other way around, so to speak, that it might be harder to deserve praise for these things that AI systems do for us, whereas it might still be possible to deserve blame because, again, we might allow bad things to happen. We might not take enough care. And we might be negligent and so on and so forth. So the criteria for praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, I think, are different, and this will matter a lot to whether you can be praiseworthy or blameworthy for the work that AI does for you. Again, the AI technology is doing something that you otherwise would have used your own intelligence to perform. So the question of praise and blame arises, not just about blame, but also about possible praise. So I've looked at everything from crashing self-driving cars to book writing computer programs to Go playing computer programs, and the question of praise and blame. And I've had these 4 different kinds of possible gaps in responsibility. And so I'm now curious to see whether you agree with me that there are these different kinds of gaps, and whether you think, as I do, that there are interesting asymmetries between blame and praise, and also blameworthiness and praiseworthiness. So thank you very much for your attention, and let's talk about it. Thank you very much.